The Church of Christ presents Let the Bible Speak with your speaker, Brett Hickey.
The devil is tearing up the home. In the United States, there are 2.4 million marriages and 1.2 million divorces every year. About 40% of all first marriages end in divorce. Certain they merely chose the wrong man or woman the first time, those who divorce set out again to find Mr. or Mrs. Right. Unfortunately, 60 to 67% of second marriages fail, and 70 to 73% of third marriages. That's from DivorceSource.com. Clearly, the solution was not to find a better pick. Ordinarily, both husband and wife have plenty of work to do on themselves to have a successful marriage. Others, because of their commitment to God, children, and church, will likely never divorce, but the quality of these relationships is a marred reflection of the standard set by Christ and the church, Ephesians 5. Why settle for a mediocre marriage? Halting, crippled, cold, joyless marriages handicap us in the expression of our greatest joint responsibility, bringing up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, Ephesians 6:4. Family counselors Gary and Marie Ezzo say, the greatest gift you can give to the wholesome development of your children is a loving, healthy relationship with your spouse. As an imperfect spouse, instead of shaming self for past failures, let us focus on an ongoing odyssey of spiritual growth. Of course, if we wait for the perfect husband to present this message, it will never be taught. Suffice it to say, we must continually transform our marriages to maximize our positive impact on our children, the church, and our communities. The greatest marriage counseling question I have ever heard: what percentage of your marriage difficulties can be laid upon your spouse? I like this question because our speech and behavior tend to communicate that most, if not all, of the blame should be laid upon our spouse. This question can expose the extent of my compliance to God's command in Philippians 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. It is easier to deceive ourselves in this area unless we are willing to pause for careful reflection. If we fail to esteem our spouse above ourselves, one of the easiest faults to fall prey to, our marriage becomes vulnerable. So, if I were to say that Louise is responsible for 80% of the difficulties in our marriage, it would be out in the open that I think I'm only 20% of the problem. I'm actually responsible for about 70% of our challenges. Next, even if I attribute 80% of the issues to Louise, by at least taking personal responsibility for some of the marital adversity, I acknowledge a truth I may avoid. I need to act on my 20% and make changes to transform our marriage into a better reflection of Christ and the church. You see, it doesn't matter what my spouse does or fails to do. I must do what's right and correct what I've done wrong to uphold my obligation to God and family. Usually when marriages are failing, neither spouse is doing all they can and should be doing. Instead, each focuses on the failures of the other. Sound familiar? That's a dead-end road. As you reflect on this message, you can detect the maturity that you bring to your marriage by noting whether you focus most on your flaws or your spouse's. Number one, to transform your marriage, you must seek God first. Seeking God first, we find in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths." Serving God and listening to God's Word will strengthen relationships at work, school, and certainly in your family. Central to the abundant life Jesus brought is a strong, healthy marriage. The closer husband and wife get to God, the less self-centered they become. The more they grow in love, and naturally the closer they will become to each other. When we seek God first, we will spend much time in prayer, and those prayers will often focus on our spouse's welfare, the positive impact we can have on our spouse, physically, mentally, and spiritually, and the positive influence our marriage can have on our children, the church, and those with whom we regularly interact. Number two, commit to restoring the intimacy you had as newlyweds. Cultivate a tenderness and affection that makes you yearn for each other's company. Jesus said in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6, "Have you not read that He who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." This passage highlights the fact that God designed marriage and purposed it to be characterized by a very special closeness. As meaningful as mom and dad have been to our development, when we marry, we are to leave. The word leave in the scriptures here comes from a word translated forsake or abandon. Tough, especially for a mom after 20 years of parenting. Understand, we can obey this teaching without being disrespectful to our parents. So Jesus is clear. No relationship on earth should rival the relationship with our spouse. Just how close should we be? According to Matthew 19:5, the man is to cleave or be joined to his wife. A.T. Robertson writes in his word pictures that the Greek word translated cleave means be glued to. Now that's close. Stuck on you is an apt description for how husband and wife should see each other. Perhaps one reason many marriages fall apart is because the glue was never applied to the marriage. We learn in Matthew 19:6 that while husband and wife are two unique individuals, when they marry, they become one flesh. We read further in Matthew 19:6, "Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." A.T. Robertson adds, "The word for joined together means yoked together, a common verb for marriage in ancient Greek." So, we envision two oxen linked together with two beams of wood. Everywhere one goes, the other is by his side. That is the type of proximity and intimacy that we should have in marriage. And what God yokes together, let not man separate. Let no man or woman come between them. If we take that approach, it will transform our marriage. The Apostle Paul takes this idea, one flesh, glued together, yoked together, one step further in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning with verse 3. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, if we implement the teaching of a couple glued together from Matthew 19, 5 and 6, what the Apostle Paul says here will follow naturally. Next, a husband can contribute positively to this aspect of marriage by showing affection toward his wife with no strings attached. This demonstrates what the Spirit articulates in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. The word cherish means keep warm, to cherish with tender love, to foster with tender care. I think of the difference between how you hold a baseball or a rose. While the one is durable, the other is delicate. The word nourish carries the idea of bringing up like a parent with a child. Now, your wife is not your daughter, but she is someone's daughter. She is still a little girl to her father and to her heavenly Father. I should care for my wife with the same kindness and tenderness that I would show my own little girl. Wouldn't you want your son-in-law to treat your daughter this way? Number 4, some husbands can transform their marriage by becoming hard-working providers. In the U.S., a Christian wife and mother should never be concerned about food, clothing, and shelter. The able-bodied man who will not provide for his own is worse than an infidel, an atheist, or an agnostic. God is so serious about husbands and fathers providing that when such a man persists in his laziness, the Scriptures command the church to withdraw from him, 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 15, putting him in the company of the idolater, adulterer, drunkard, railer, and common thief. On the flip side, wives can transform their marriage by living within their means. The love of possessions, the insatiable craving for more, by husband or wife, will always place a strain on a marriage. The Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." The Spirit adds in 1 Timothy 6, verse 8, "And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content." The world sends a totally different message, suggesting that lavish spending is central to a great marriage. As a result, living beyond one's means often begins on the wedding day. A September 2014 study by economics professors Andrew Francis and Hugo Maillon at Emory University examined the association between wedding spending and marriage duration from a survey of over 3,000 people in the United States. Their study, A Diamond is Forever and Other Fairy Tales, found that brides who spend $20,000 or more on their wedding are 3.5 times more likely to end up divorced than their frugal counterparts who spent less than half that amount. Spending more on an engagement ring, the average price being roughly $2,500 according to the report, is also linked to shorter marriages. Prior to World War II, in Western countries, only 10% of engagement rings contained a diamond. By the end of the century, about 80% did. And in 2012, total expenditures on diamond rings were roughly $7 billion in the United States. Using the Emory research, Randall Olson, a fourth-year computer science graduate research assistant at Michigan State University, found that couples who spend $20,000 on their wedding, excluding the cost of the ring, are 46% more likely than average to get divorced. Couples who spend between $1,000 and $5,000 are 18% less likely than average to get divorced. And those who spend less than $1,000 are 53% less likely to get divorced. DivorceSource.com. Well, next, husbands and wives can transform their marriages with verbal affirmations. I love Proverbs 3:27. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in the power of your hand to do so. For 18 years of his life, we know nothing, Jesus said. With all the scriptures omit on the life of Christ, we do get to read the Father's message to Jesus at his baptism in Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. Do you remember what the Father's voice thundered? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. In other words, I love you, and I'm proud of you. An old farmer and his wife went to see their young preacher for marriage counseling. The inexperienced counselor listened to the couple for an hour, but couldn't think of any profound suggestions. Finally, he said to the old farmer, "Brother, in order for your marriage to improve, here's what needs to happen." The young preacher got up, walked around the desk, and gave the farmer's wife a hug and said, "I love you." The farmer said, "Well, sounds good to me. Should I bring her on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday?" Another woman complained to her husband, "You never tell me you love me." Reportedly, he said, "I told you I loved you when we got married. If I ever change my mind, I'll let you know." Don't you think Jesus knew the Father loved him? Of course. But the Father told him anyway. A husband who wants to transform his marriage will whisper those words his wife most wants to hear. I love you. On the other hand, the godly wife will transform her marriage by telling her husband what he most needs to hear. It's interesting how the Spirit sums up the great section on marriage in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. The wife needs to feel loved. The husband needs to feel respected. The wife who wants the most fulfilling marriage will tell her husband she is proud of him by sharing areas in which she admires him. Men may not need verbal affirmation in as many ways as women, but we do need to hear our wives verbalize respect and appreciation for our hard work, for being good fathers, for being faithful spouses and faithful Christians, for using our natural giftedness, our generosity, etc. Wouldn't even hurt to brag on our hunting or fishing success, our mechanical abilities, and handyman skills. Not only can we transform our marriages by what we say, we can also transform them by how we say what we say, as well as by what we avoid saying. Funny how the flesh leads us to say the absolute wrong thing, or to say it in the wrong way. Yes, we men are often clueless, but we can't use that as a crutch. We must learn from our mistakes and grow. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12, verse 36, "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment." When we talk with our wives, we can't holler like we do at the dog. We don't bully our wives. We men get all sanctimonious when we teach and preach devotion to the church, but then we get home and we go all Archie Bunker on our wives. this certainly won't play in heaven. Remember, the words nourish and cherish carry the idea of a tenderness and warmth like that of a mother and a child. Solomon charges in Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Watch the amazing power of a soft answer to an angry outburst. Ordinarily, it will almost immediately de-escalate a tense discussion. As the spiritual leader in the home, when a disagreement develops, a husband must demonstrate the patience that Christ shows the church. At the same time, the godly wife must also guard her tongue. Nagging is not effective when your husband is dead wrong. The Lord knew this. That's why the Spirit says in 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning with verse 1, wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. Finally, in our hustle-bustle world, husbands and wives say, well, we don't get to spend much time together, but when we do, boy, it is quality time. By all means, let's have quality time, but not at the expense of quantity time. Remember what we've already learned about cleaving, about being glued to our spouse? Clinical psychologist and marriage counselor Dr. Willard F. Harley Jr. has sold over 1 million copies of His Needs, Her Needs and translated into 12 languages. He stunned me by insisting that husbands who want a strong marriage will set aside 15 hours a week to give their wives undivided attention. He spent 50 years counseling, and he knows firsthand. We may have to plan it into our busy schedule. Church, family Bible time, eating at the table, walks together, recreation together, etc. But we can make it happen. 15 hours is less than 10% of our 168-hour week. Before our song and wrap up, we want to encourage you to begin a life-changing Bible study by mail at no cost to you. I'll be back in a moment for a final word.
Here we are, but straying pilgrims here, our path is often dim, but to cheer us on our journey still, we sing this wayside hymn. Yonder over the rolling river, where the shining mansions rise, soon will be our home forever, and the smile of the blessed giver gladdens all our longing eyes. Here
please send us any comments or questions that you may have about today's message or any related question about the Church of the Bible. We hope you'll tune in every Lord's Day and join us for worship at one of the congregations that will be listed shortly. Call or write for a transcript, CD, or a DVD of number 1109, Transform Your Marriage. As the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 16, verse 16, the churches of Christ salute you. Until next week, goodbye and God bless.